Welcome to the 48th Annual Symposium on the American Indian. This session is titled Healing Through Language, Creating New Visionaries for Improving Health with Dr. D.H. Whalen, Endangered Language Fund, along with Bri Alexander, Shawnee Tribe, Cherokee Nation, City University of New York. As you probably know, this session is one of many that are included in this year's virtual agenda. Please do take time to visit our website at nsuok.edu/symposium for more details regarding the agenda. All sessions will be recorded and made available in the coming weeks. And then one thing to point out, Bri Alexander will not be presenting with us today, but she has recorded her session and it will be available later. So hello, my name is Gabrielle Butter. I am a representative of Alpha Pi Omega, the first Native American sorority in the United States. I am a senior here at NSU. I'll be graduating this summer, and I am graduating in English and Media Studies. All right, and I'll pass it off to you, Whalen.
Okay, let me find my, oops. One second, not quite sure why. All right. Okay, so hopefully everybody can see that. I think, oops. Okay, hopefully here we go. So thank you for the honor of allowing us to address you. We will be alternating voices throughout this presentation. Bri's will be recorded. While I would have preferred to be with you in Tahlequah, I am currently on the ancestral lands of the Quinnipiac and related Algonquian tribes, and I acknowledge their stewardship of the land. My background, I come to you as a non-native person who has worked for over 20 years to help maintain indigenous languages in the US and the world. I founded the Endangered Language Fund, which provides grants for such work. For 2 years, I directed the Documenting Endangered Languages program at the National Science Foundation that has now been renamed Dynamic Language Infrastructure, but it's still basically the same program. So in the time over the past years, a perspective on language revitalization that has seemed to be too little recognized, even among those doing the heroic work of maintaining and reviving their languages, has come to my mind, namely health. And Bri and I would like to share that perspective now. As I said, Bri has recorded her comments. Let's see, hang on just a second.
First and foremost, I wanted to start with a knowledge credit that this presentation is ultimately a culmination of many hours, years, and generations of personal, communal, and ancestral knowledge. While my perspective is indeed mine alone, it is also derived from innumerable conversations, experiences, and worldviews coming into one embodied personality. The knowledge presented here belongs to all of us, is in no way complete, and will continue to be shaped in the time to come.
Okay. Oops.
So who even am I to be giving this presentation? As I said on the first slide, Hatito, Osio, hello. Lalo kachititha ni sawanwa withoe. Jonen takwado chalagani. Bri is my English given name. And on my father's side, we're enrolled with the Shawnee Tribe and Cherokee Nation, and on my mother's side, we're Karaite Jewish. I'm a PhD student in linguistic anthropology at the City University of New York Graduate Center, though I do have a master's already in Native American languages and linguistics from the University of Arizona. I currently reside on occupied Lenape lands. I'm recording this presentation from occupied Lenape lands, and my current institution occupies Lenape lands. And in those fleeting moments where I'm not studying or doing research, I find myself mostly beading, which is a phenomenal medicine for me. And I'm actually more of a collaborator and not really a presenter anymore, so this format is just really bizarre for me. Normally I'd rather do a workshop, and actually, hear your thoughts and do a knowledge exchange instead of, presenting as if like I'm this knowledge holder. So that was the purpose of the knowledge credit. So please bear with me as I go through this presentation, as this is just not how I tend to do things.
So Bri and I are alternating in this presentation, as I mentioned, and we are both striving to see with two eyes, one Western, one Indigenous. Of course, our backgrounds make one eye easier for each of us, but we believe that the combination has great benefits. So why revitalize? Language revitalization is hard. Even when you are dedicated, it's hard. So why do it? As Daryl Kep put it, you can always find someone willing to tell you you can't do it. It's up to you to keep going. There are many reasons to do it, but I'm going to focus on health. So there are many urgent issues in every Native community: sovereignty, safety, land, employment, health, maintaining culture. Language seldom comes up as a solution to these challenges. It is part of culture, but not necessary for it. Still, language is the most efficient means of keeping the various parts of culture together. For example, not everybody wants to do baskets or canoes or singing or any other cultural activity, but language can serve all of them. So it appears that most language revitalization programs in North America are housed within the culture department of the tribe or other group that sponsors them. There are certainly other urgent issues, and culture often comes last when it comes to making funding decisions. While this is understandable, it has forced many language programs to restrict their goals, delay development, or even cease operations altogether. So if we start thinking of health, we can imagine language programs as a social service. So communities do not start language programs just to teach the language. I'm a professional linguist and I love seeing lots of interesting languages, but that's not the reason that communities keep them alive. They want to reclaim more of the culture and a way of life. But it turns out that this effort has health benefits. And this is not just mental health, but physical health as well. So if that is the case, then simply promoting our language programs as culture is underselling them, and underselling them to our detriment.
Oh, wow. So my presentation today is really about the process of re-envisioning concepts, and specifically re-envisioning language and health, and what these two concepts mean in a specific Indigenous context. And I want to emphasize that I'm presenting only one Indigenous perspective, which is my own. So this is not to say that there's only one way to approach these concepts, or even to limit what we think falls under the categories of both. On the contrary, this presentation is meant to expand upon what we think is possible under these categories, and ultimately, as Doug's presentation shows, what these different imaginings open up for us in our communities. Diving right in then, we're going to start with re-envisioning language in an Indigenous context. Dominant normalized perspectives of language in the academy and other institutions widely focus on language as either an abstract grammatical system with rules, or language as communication, whether that's verbal and nonverbal. And it's not that these are wrong, or that these are, perspectives that we shouldn't be using, because obviously there's a lot of value in these types of perspectives. But I personally have two favorite Indigenous perspectives on what language is, and those two are language as a gift and language as a living being. Again, there are other Indigenous perspectives that are just as interesting and meaningful as language as a living being, but because of time constraints, I'm only going to focus on re-envisioning it this way. So when we think about language as alive, with agency, we can imagine ourselves as having a relationship with language. Language is a friend, a supporter, an ally, a caregiver, whatever role you want to imagine. Envisioning language as a living being gives agency to language. The dominant normalized perspective would have us thinking about language as an object to be acted on by us. It's sleeping and we must wake it. It's dying and we must revitalize it. You all know how the stories go. But language as a living being asks us to consider that the language is fine. It's there, it always has been, it always will be, but our relationship to language and how we treat language is where the work needs to be done. Building a relationship with language is thus a futurity project and doesn't seek to locate language in one point in time, but allows it to grow in tandem with us. Just to state this as plainly as I can, instead of viewing language as something to be acted on by us, we can think of language as a living being with whom we need to tend the relationship. Re-envisioning language as a living being asks us to treat language as a friend, inviting them into our homes and lives, turning to them for advice, checking in on them to make sure they're okay, taking them out to enjoy activities with us, and supporting them however they need. When I re-envision language, which honestly is a process I engage in weekly, if not daily, I also notice the types of questions I ask about my conceptualizations, because the questions we ask also guide how we think about concepts. For example, if language is a friend, if language is a living being with agency, instead of asking, what is language, might we ask, who is language, and who can language be? By changing the question even slightly, we fundamentally alter how we conceptualize language. And for me, thinking of language as a who makes me more aware of how I treat my indigenous languages. I wouldn't ask my partner for a book breaking down their habits, personality, schedule, history, etc. No, I'd sit with them over time and learn by interacting and asking and listening. So can we do that with language? I also wouldn't ask my partner to only hang out in my kitchen or at a restaurant or every other Friday. No, I'd want them everywhere. Where is language and where can language be? I wouldn't build a relationship with my partner based solely on my own personal needs or what I need from a relationship. No, I'd consider their needs as well. Can we consider those for language? Now, normally, as I said, this would be more of a workshop, and I would invite you to take time now to think about these things, but as this is a recorded Zoom presentation, I will invite you to consider these questions and whichever other questions arise for you on your own time. Hoba. So now that we've seen how to re-envision language, let's look into re-envisioning health in an indigenous context. Dominant normalized perspectives of health tend to view health as individual ailments to be treated, thinking about symptom alleviation over root cause. The medicine used also tends to change internal processes and signals instead of looking at the root cause in a holistic way. Health is also typically divided in parts or systems within an individual body, where there are specialists that can focus on one aspect, such as a cardiologist for the heart or a neurologist for the brain. It also tends to separate things like mental health from physical health as if they exist in separate realities. And finally, treatments involved usually take extracted chemicals, which completely disconnects medicine from its source, and medicine becomes a word, Tylenol, and not a being, such as a plant. So my favorite indigenous perspectives of health is one that views health as holistic well-being in balance, where you're thinking about well-being in relation to community, to culture, to nature, and spirituality, just to name a few. And treatments involve a variety of practices and medicines in their whole forms, from plant medicines to rituals to also using dominant perspectives of health. One of my favorite indigenous perspectives of how to envision health as holistic well-being is to think about the 7 directions. And the 7 directions are, if we think about the 4 cardinal directions, but also having to include above, here, and below. For me, above represents spiritual balance. Here represents communal and physical balance, and below represents natural balance. And in order to have a holistic well-being, we must think about our health in all of these directions. Also, what does it mean to ask about somebody's well-being? Well, it's not only asking about internalized embodied feelings. When you think about it in English, we use the phrase, how are you? And a response is typically a list of adjectives of how we're feeling. But if you ask someone that in a Cherokee context, for example, you would actually ask about balance and if they're balanced. And if the person is unbalanced, you'd look to find the root of their imbalance, which could be in a variety of different places and not just embodied feelings. And the goal of all of this is when you strengthen one person, you strengthen everyone and also the earth. Instead of viewing health as individual physical ailments to be treated, we can think of health as holistic well-being comprised of various levels and systems of balance. Re-envisioning health as holistic well-being asks us to investigate spiritual, communal, mental, natural, cultural, and physical imbalances in a macro system of relationships. Re-envisioning health in an Indigenous context has me wondering about our healing practices. As I mentioned at the beginning, I'm actually recording this presentation instead of doing it live because I've been dealing with health challenges for over a year and I'm currently in recovery. This experience this past year has completely shifted how I relate to health and healing practices. I mean, I have teams of specialists who regularly perform various tests on every aspect of my physical body and mental state. And most of my tests come back with results that are abnormal but non-specific. And my specialists still tell me point blank that since they can't pinpoint what's wrong with me despite copious amounts of data, that I must either be healthy or at least healthy enough to not merit further investigation or treatment. Which means I just have to continue feeling unhealthy and living my life accordingly. In all honesty, the best that I felt is after this past summer when I was fortunate enough to get to visit Crossan Smith. And he told me to keep using Western medication for some of my issues, but he also told me to focus on connecting my body to my spirit and love. And while I honestly have no idea how to practically do that, because there's not really a manual for that, it somehow makes sense, and it makes me feel stronger every day that I wake up and I set my attention to do that. So the questions I've been asking myself this past year in regards to health are, what does it mean to be well and or healthy, if those are different things, in an Indigenous context? Also, do our languages support pathways towards being well and or being healthy? I mean, can we talk about our health ailments in our Indigenous languages? And if not, what does that do for us and what does that mean and how does that shift how we embody our illnesses? Also, how do our bodies react when we try to improve our well-being and our health with a variety of healing practices, from using the dominant health system to trying traditional Indigenous medicine? Do our bodies react differently depending on how much of one or another we do? And how does language play into all of this? Again, I invite you to consider these questions and whatever other questions come to you on your own time.
So taking the other viewpoint, I'm going to be looking at Western evidence for health benefits of language use and revitalization. So there have been several studies published in recent years that have shown that maintenance of indigenous languages has health benefits. Like all scientific studies, these are only pieces of the full story, but they give good reason to think of language programs as health programs. With Margaret Moss and Daryl Baldwin, I published a survey a few years ago of those studies, and I'll outline some of those now. And some 3 recent supposedly contrary results will also be discussed. So I'm talking about language revitalization programs, not the delivery of Western medical information. So I'm not going to be talking about translating Western health information into native languages. Those can be quite valuable. For example, Henderson's work in Mayan communities. But North America has very few communities with monolingual speakers, so assessing programs is more relevant to our continent. North America also, as you know, has some of the world's largest health disparities between native and mainstream populations. There is not much data. It's true that there aren't very many studies, but there are even fewer that demonstrate either a lack of effect or a negative effect. One reason for this is that language programs didn't used to be necessary. When children learned language from the cradle board on up, there was no need to have a revitalization program. The language was being learned as it has for millennia. So it's only been in recent times that exact revitalization programs have even been necessary. And even the 30 or 40 years that the longest running ones, the Maori and the Hawaiian, have been going is a relatively short time for epidemiological studies. And of course, indigenous communities receive less attention than they need. I wanted to put the published studies in relationship to more native definitions of health to further expand on Bri's comments. In order to get published in the Western literature, you more or less have to assume a Western definition of health. This is something that is not necessarily in line with the community's view of health. I was a little surprised to see that the World Health Organization does in fact have a more inclusive definition. They state health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. This is closer to a native definition than I expected from the World WHO. Native perspectives differ, of course. Communities differ across the country. So some of these generalities will not necessarily be true for everyone, but it is often the case that communities will include a spiritual aspect in their definition. So Daryl Baldwin, for example, speaking of the Miamia perspective, emphasizes living well and properly, having awareness, wisdom, and knowledge. Suina reports on the Pueblo Convention of 2012, in which one of the goals of the convocation was to encourage Pueblo people to think about health beyond current limited associations with physical health, illness, and seeking medical care at a local Indian health facility. And she summarized their discussion in 7 points, which I'll go over very briefly. Spirituality, community, family and children, physical health, traditional foods, hard work, and breastfeeding. Another definition comes from Canada, focusing on wellness, traditional elements, and using frameworks familiar to Indigenous people. And then there was a survey that looked at a fair number of North American traditions and found that the natural elements, songs, prayers, and holy sites were provided by the Creator, and relying on them is vital to the healing process. Without the proper protocol or ceremony, these elements are not in their full power. Traditional healing occurs when one is determined to be healthy. This particular article does not go on to say that in many cultures, the proper protocol includes the traditional language. So connecting to community, it's often through spirituality, is a feature of native definitions of wellness that is generally lacking in Western definitions. Relating wellness to the native understanding of the world is important, and that has to, of course, to be specific to a particular community. Allowing participation in ceremonies or traditions is important, even though this is often at odds with institutional settings, as anyone who has tried to smudge a hospital room will tell you. And as Bri also mentions, combining these approaches with Western medicine can achieve the benefits of both. So here are some implications of the definitions. They're going to differ by different communities, but the ideal situation is when each of those differences is respected. This takes work and contribution both of the community and institutions like the IHS. So, but I'm going to discuss the published results, and as I mentioned, the default use is Western medical definitions, and we'll come back to this again later. So published data are typically quantitative. To be quantitative, categories have to be measured and defined and up to some sort of quantification. However, many of the insights from Native communities are more qualitative. Qualitative research can get published, but it is generally held in lower esteem in the scientific realm and is deemed to be less informative than quantitative research. Alice Taff has come up with a phrase that I think puts qualitative research in a better light, where she calls it eyewitness accounts. And I think this puts exactly the right emphasis. It's not perfect data, but it is direct and meaningful and ought to be treated as such. Okay, on to the published results. Almost all the published results show an improvement in physical and mental health due to native language use. All the studies have limitations, and we could discuss those. And then I'll go through the three rather spurious counterexamples. So one of the more interesting and highly cited studies is Hallett, Chandler, and Lalonde, 2007, who found that suicide rates declined when fluency in the relevant indigenous language was greater. So communities which had more of the seven cultural factors that they looked at: self-government, land claims, education, healthcare, cultural facilities, police and fire service, and language, had reduced suicide rates. So the number of cultural continuity factors, when there were 0 that didn't have language, then there was a very high rate. When there was at least 1, and presumably this would be the language, there was a very low to non-existent suicide rate. And this was true all the way up until 4 factors. So this seems like a somewhat contrary result, but it turns out that the number of cases was so small that I believe this represented 2 individual suicides. So basically, language was a protective factor for suicide, and as we know, suicide is a severe problem in Native America. Other youth risk factors were reduced in various studies. The best ones have been from Australia, so I'll present those. So one study was looking at whether there had been risky alcohol consumption in the last 12 months. Speakers reported it 8% of the time, non-speakers 18%. Other illicit substances 16% versus 26%. And then being a victim of physical or threatened violence, 25% versus 37%. Not a direct result that you might expect. A little bit more data from that same survey. So that's that number I just mentioned. And then there was also the binge drinking in the past 2 weeks. Speakers reported that far less frequently. So just listing those numbers don't really tell us how convincing those results are. When epidemiologists talk about a problem, they talk about the percentage of reduction in that problem. When you calculate it that way, the numbers are between 30 and 56%. And these are considered really terrific improvements. So even though the numbers seem perhaps a bit small, they are in fact quite impressive in terms of epidemiological studies. Various groups have shown that speaking the language improves graduation rates. The one that I find the most impressive is the Hawaiian immersion, who had 100% high school graduation rate. I believe they still do. I haven't checked this number in a while. And at first I thought, well, joining the Hawaiian immersion program is a choice, so perhaps only the good students joined it. But Beulah Wilson assures me that those people who could afford to send their children to private school continue to do so and did not send them to the immersion program, and that typically these students would have about a 60% graduation rate. So it's very impressive. There's some Canadian data that shows that for those who are still on tribal reserves, that speaking the language improves the probability of doing well in school. If they're off the reserve, things get a little murkier, but of course everything gets a little murky when you go off reserve in terms of interacting daily with your language. So the language use is probably not as coherent off reserve. Another physical one, there was a significant decline in the rates of diabetes in those communities that had higher language use. Again, this is Canadian data from Oster et al. 2011. And as you can see, there's a huge spread in the amount of indigenous language knowledge among the communities. Nobody got up to 100%, nobody was at 0, but there was a very strong correlation so that the more communities spoke the language and had knowledge of the language, the lower their diabetes rate was. The same has been found for obesity. The direct measure was traditionalism, not language, but the language questions accounted for 1/4 of the traditionalism score. So it's something of an index of language use. Attendance at ceremonies, participation in ceremonies, and percentage of life lived off reservation were the other issues for traditionalism. So we would have to do further work to see if language makes the strongest contribution. So I mentioned there were a handful of counterexamples. One claimed that there was more obesity in Métis children, but there were only 5.9% of the participants in that study who were speakers. So this is an extremely small number, and small numbers lead to spurious results in many cases. Ryan et al. 2016 reported there was increased smoking with increased language use in the Inuit communities, but even the authors admitted that this might just be from ritual use of tobacco rather than overuse. They couldn't distinguish those from their data. They were using survey data. And then the same group of authors said that there was an increase in smoking in Canadian youth, but they had a non-significant results, and it's inappropriate to talk about non-significant results as if they were significant. So basically, the counterexamples are weak or non-existent. There might be some, there's a lot of talk these days about epigenetics. It may be that epigenetics can explain part of what's going on. Basically, if language heals epigenetic damage, that would be great. If it works by other means, that would be great too. So just a couple of quick eyewitness accounts. Leanne Hinton talks about an elder who simply did better just by participating as a master in a master apprentice pairing. Ended up having better health just from doing that work. Another example from J.C. Hall, who may have graduated, I didn't check, she became a PhD student at Oregon, and she discovered that she was in a bad state and needed to clean up her act before she would even be in a position to learn the language. So she actually had the health benefit even before starting the language. So it's hard to publish these eyewitness accounts. I think they are important because every time I talk to somebody from a community, they say, well, yes, of course it improves health. But putting the accounts into an accessible format would be useful, I think, even if it's not formal. If they put it in newsletters, websites, blogs, and other outlets, at some point they could be aggregated and perhaps then be publishable. And I think they are of value. So again, I'm focusing on language. It's very hard to tell whether language itself is the cause. Epidemiological work has a really hard time separating cause from effect. And in the case of language, it's never, of course, the case that language is simply taught as a bunch of words. The culture comes along with it. So separating out the effects of culture would be left up to cases where people are reviving the culture without the language, and I have not seen any studies that look at that. But it certainly is the case that there is sufficient evidence to find a convincing case to be made for treating language programs as health programs.
Oh wow, we've made it pretty far. So I've just given an example and walkthrough of my own re-envisioning process for language and health. And I strongly believe re-envisioning processes are necessary for our communities. But why do I think this? What's the actual purpose of re-envisioning? First and foremost, the process of re-envisioning concepts in an indigenous context is inherently an indigenizing process, which is necessary if we're to find and make meaning out of these concepts for our own communities. And this is absolutely not to say that concepts that aren't indigenized first can't be useful to us. Of course they can be, and it'd be a terrible disservice to indigenous communities to suggest otherwise. So I'm 100% not suggesting that whatsoever. But I would argue that these concepts do serve us better when they are centered on our indigenous beliefs, worldviews, and values. When we center concepts on our realities and stories, that's when concepts are most likely to impact and benefit our unique communities. Research has shown this to be true for a variety of concepts too, not just language and health. Secondly, the act of re-envisioning automatically opens up new possibilities because the process asks you to redo and rethink something in a new way. When we get comfortable with one conceptualization, like language as a grammatical system, we tend to focus our energy on creating a world where this conceptualization is true. And doing so makes other conceptualizations invisible or even unworthy of consideration, which means we've limited what we think is possible and worthy to explore. So actively re-envisioning concepts that we've gotten comfortable with allows us to see there are other ways of thinking, such as language as a living being. And in realizing there are other ways of thinking, we can then come up with creative and new responses to the challenges we face, the interests we have, and the lives we live. And finally, our futures need us to re-envision. It's an unfortunate reality that many of our indigenous communities face stark health challenges for various reasons, from the effects of colonization and racism to inaccessible foods, water, and resources. The practice of re-envisioning helps us make connections between categories we might not have previously grouped together. As Doug and others have discussed, language might have a direct effect on health and well-being, and as such, should receive funding from health sources to create language opportunities. By indigenizing these concepts, we can envision a future for our communities where we are healthy and thriving, and we can work today to build that future for ourselves. So we need to think, what type of world are we actively building for our youth, for our elders, for knowledge keepers, for our healers, for our future generations? Can we build opportunities? And can we fill our futures with hope? I strongly believe we can, and I believe re-envisioning and indigenizing concepts will get us there. In summary of today's points, we're not trying to replace conceptualizations of language health with one another, but we're trying to re-envision possibilities of what these concepts might look like in our indigenous communities. By doing so, we open up new opportunities for growth, which then could change what we do to build a future for our communities. We've practiced re-envisioning today with the concepts of language and health, but we could do this with other concepts too. The important part is that we do these re-envisionings with community in mind so that they ultimately meet our community's unique needs.
So the Endangered Language Fund has established an initiative called Healing Through Language, and its purpose is to provide more evidence of the benefits of language revitalization and simultaneously to generate funds both for the study of such effects and for the revitalization itself. So here are some recommendations. If you run a language program and plan to study health outcomes, look to health organizations for funding. I have to confess, research is expensive. It takes a lot of resources and everybody is stretched, so it helps to have funding to do it. Federal and foundation sources are available. If your tribal government has a health department, you can seek funding from them. Don't undersell your language revitalization program. Provide funders with the evidence and ask how they can afford not to fund such a relatively inexpensive program with such broad positive health benefits. Our hope is that some of the visionaries of Indian country will promote and assess the healing power of reclaiming and revitalizing native languages.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Dr. Whalen. There is a question in the chat. So Melissa asked, would you say the majority of participants in your review study were fluent language speakers or learners?
So those were a mixture of both. And as you could see in the diabetes study, there was no community that was at 100% language ability. So clearly there was a mixture, some fluent speakers, some not so fluent. But certainly the revitalization programs show that there are beneficial effects of people who are learning the language as a second language, and that these benefits are still there.
Very much. And then also, does the healing benefit depend on total fluency in the native language? You kind of.
Yeah, so I mean, that's related to the previous one, but in fact, we don't really know. I mean, certainly my experience is that there are communities that are not trying to have full fluency because they see it as an unrealistic goal. And for their situation, it could well be. They would like to be able to sing a song or say a prayer and perhaps, you know, do some greetings and so forth, and they're happy with that. Does that have the same level of health benefit? Maybe, maybe not. We really just don't know. Again, there's not enough evidence to show all these things conclusively.
And so doesn't it make more sense to address medical issues directly instead of learning the language?
So I mean, sometimes you think it does, but what really strikes me about the use of language to address these issues is that everything that we've looked at, you know, all these different physical and mental health issues that have shown improvement, they're not specific. And so if you're addressing multiple issues at once and each one of them is benefiting, it seems like a really great health program. And indeed, many of the programs that do directly assess something, for example, suicide, won't find the same rate of success anyway. So it really, I mean, but it is still a good question. It's an open issue, and there's again not enough research, but we're hoping to get there.
Thank you. And then just one more question, unless there's any more in the chat. Is learning at distance over Zoom perhaps as good as in-person learning for seeing health benefits?
You know, this is something that actually predates the pandemic, since many communities were using even kind of clunky television distance learning 20 years ago. And again, we really don't know. It's likely that in-person has better outcomes for language learning, but does doing an online job and getting somewhere with the language have the same health benefit? To my knowledge, no one has looked at that. It's a really it's an area that needs to be studied because as far as I know, no one at all has looked at it.
Thank you. And I'll just ask one more time if there's any more questions to put them in the chat. And as I see none, I'll go ahead and conclude. So thank you to our presenters and to those who have joined us virtually today. Please take time to